Leader and author Stacey Abrams, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to jump right into it because Kentucky just held its primary, but two of the state's most populous counties only had one polling location each, which has prompted a lot of calls of voter suppression. Is that the case?
Voter suppression exists whenever eligible voters are prohibited through administrative rules from being able to cast their ballots. And while I would give great credit to Governor Beshear and to the Republican Secretary of State, Michael Adams, they wanted to encourage as many Kentuckians as possible to vote by mail, and they did indeed increase that. We have to always recall that and hold true that some voters cannot or will not vote by mail. And that's why it's so critical that we have early voting locations and in person voting locations. And while they did their best, I think, to try to encourage the vote by mail and they recognized the need for in person, it was insufficient for the turnout. And that's one of the reasons we are working so hard across the country to raise the awareness of how voter suppression works, sometimes through malfeasance and sometimes through a benign neglect. The reality is, no matter what the reason is, if voters can't cast their ballots, democracy isn't working.
Let's turn over to Georgia's primary because there were also major reports of issues with absentee ballots, of which you even said that you experienced some issues with. So can you walk us, what went down in your home state specifically?
Well, similar to Republican Secretary of State Michael Adams in Kentucky, the Republican Secretary of State here in Georgia, Brad Rassenberger, did the right thing to encourage vote by mail through sending out applications. Unfortunately, that was the end of his good behavior. What we then faced was the implementation of $106 million worth of machines with inadequate training and adequate resourcing. Some of the machines were inoperable. Absentee ballots applications were sent out, but not every application that was sent out was actually, when people responded and requested ballots, the ballots were being served by a third party out of Arizona. And so thousands of Georgians never received their ballots. There was no one to call to ensure that you got what you needed. And my personal experience was that my absentee ballot, I finally got it, filled it out, but the envelope was sealed shut and it was impossible for me to get a replacement envelope, even with 3 to 4 weeks of request. And so we know that the breakdown in Georgia was a combination of the underlying voter suppression that we have faced in the state for too long. And then layered on top of it was the incompetence and the deliberate indifference of the Secretary of State for voters. In fact, he has consistently maintained that he had no responsibility and no accountability. And he made this grand announcement last week that he was finally going to do his job by ensuring that we had polling places open, that given that one of the polling places in Atlanta had to serve 16,000 registered voters. That is, number one, absolutely inexcusable. But number two, it's the job of the Secretary of State not simply to promote one good idea, but to ensure the effective operation of elections so that democracy doesn't differ from county to county.
Out specific concrete steps just now, and it follows a book that you have just written called Our Time Is Now, and it's your blueprint to ending voter suppression. And in it you said, I'm going to read verbatim, quote, "It should shock none of us that the struggle for dominion over our nation's future and who will participate is simply a battle for American power." My question to you is, how do American voters win that battle?
They win that battle by demanding that we actually have a democracy that works. The United States is an outlier in the fact that individual voters have to be responsible for understanding the laws in 50 different states if they want to register to vote. In most industrialized, democratized nations, voter registration is automatic. Automatic voter registration exists in the United States, but only in a handful of states. With it being truly automatic, you have more access in other states, but the United States should be responsible for voter registration, automatic registration, same day registration. We also should have uniformity in access to the ballot. That means mail-in ballots. That means making sure that we have in-person early voting for at least 3 weeks. 15 days is usually the standard. And that we have in-person voting polling locations available to all voters. We have to think about the fact that if you are disabled, if you have a language barrier, if you are homeless or displaced, if you are someone who has had a bad experience with any of these systems, sometimes you only trust in-person voting. And so we cannot move to a fully universal vote by mail system. There are some states that have been able to do that, but their demography is not identical to the rest of the country. And so we need to have uniformity, and that has to be in place and enforced by the federal government. That's why H.R. 1, the first bill passed by this Congress, is the bill that we need to promote. It will likely not pass in 2020, but when we win the White House and win the Senate, it needs to be one of the first bills passed in 2021.
Are you concerned about voter turnout during the general election in November?
I'm concerned about certain segments of our community that are depressed because we cannot forget that in the midst of COVID-19, African Americans in particular have the highest rate of contracting the disease and dying from it, double any other community. But African Americans are also facing a disproportionate effect from the economic collapse. You layer on top of that the unrest and the deep distrust of our systems, and we are going to have a very intentional, targeted approach to making sure that particularly young African Americans actually participate in this election. But I do see that in Georgia, in Kentucky, and around the country, we have seen record turnout by Democrats. And so I think there is enthusiasm. I think there's interest. I think there's a willingness to vote, but the apparatus has to work. But we also have to continue to push up and down the ballot for engagement of voters who think not the question of whether they will vote Democrat or Republican, but whether they will vote or not vote because they don't believe the system works for them.
Now, I've got to turn over to presumptive Democratic candidate Joe Biden because he said he'll pick a woman as his VP, and Senator Amy Klobuchar had also bowed out from consideration, saying that he should pick a woman of color specifically. So I just got to ask, are you being vetted?
I refer all vetting questions to the Biden campaign, and they are going to run the process they run, and I look forward to understanding and participating in making sure that Joe Biden and whomever he chooses is, that they're successful. But the vetting campaign, the vetting process is in the hands of the Biden campaign. I encourage everyone to reach out to them.
Can I get a comment on just, Biden has a bit of a controversial past, particularly as it relates to women and Black people. So do you think in choosing a woman of color that could potentially help offset the criticisms that he's received from those communities?
I think Joe Biden has done his best to respond to critiques, legitimate critiques. He has done the work necessary of listening and of promoting policies and behaviors that improve his access and then improve his trustworthiness. He doesn't take any community for granted. Separate from that, I do believe in diversity. I believe diversity is best exemplified not simply through word, but through deed. And having a woman of color, having a Black woman at the top of the ticket with Joe Biden could be an incredibly strong and smart signal. But I do not believe that Joe Biden takes anyone for granted. And I think that if you watch what's happened over the last month and a half, his willingness to engage, his willingness to listen stands in direct contrast to the misogynistic, racist, homophobic leadership that we have seen from Donald Trump.
Stacey Abrams, thank you for your time and your insight.
Thank you.